Look at a map of the world today. Those lines separating nations seem so permanent, so fixed, as if they were always meant to be there. But what if I told you that many of these borders were not drawn by generals on battlefields or by popular vote, but by diplomats hunched over parchment by candlelight centuries ago? Imagine a single piece of paper, signed by hands long turned to dust, still whispering commands to the modern world, dictating where one country ends and another begins. From the jagged edges of Europe to the vast, straight-line frontiers cutting across Africa, the ghosts of these ancient agreements are everywhere, quietly shaping everything from international trade to regional conflicts. We live in a world built on promises made in a different age, and most of us never even stop to wonder why. This is the story of the first international treaties, the foundational pacts that introduced the very idea that sovereign states could sit down, negotiate, and formalize their relationships through written words. These were not just documents of their time, they were blueprints for the future, establishing principles like territorial sovereignty and mutual recognition that became the bedrock of our modern global system. The decisions made in those distant meetings, often fueled by war, ambition, or the simple need for order, created a ripple effect that has traveled across oceans and centuries, arriving intact on the shores of our present day. They are the hidden architects of our reality, the reason a river marks a boundary here or a mountain range divides cultures there, and why some borders feel natural while others spark endless tension. So join me on a journey back through time, to the candlelit chambers and royal courts where the map of our world was first sketched out. We will uncover the secrets behind these enduring documents, meet the long-forgotten diplomats whose signatures still hold power, and unravel the mysteries of how a fragile piece of parchment can outlive empires and influence the destiny of millions. This is a deep dive into the origins of the lines that define us, an exploration of history's most lasting handshake, and an investigation into why the past is never really past when it comes to the borders we call home. Long before the concept of a global community or international law, our world was a patchwork of competing kingdoms, empires, and city-states, each vying for power with little regard for formal rules of engagement. In this tumultuous environment, the very first international treaties emerged not from a place of idealistic cooperation, but from sheer necessity. They were fragile, often hastily scribbled agreements born from the ashes of conflict, the pressing demands of commerce, or the strategic alliances forged through royal marriages. Think of them as the earliest prototypes for the complex diplomatic machinery we have today, clumsy, imperfect, but utterly revolutionary for their time. These documents introduced a groundbreaking idea that sovereign powers, despite their differences and deep-seated rivalries, could sit down and formalize their relationships through written words. This was a monumental shift from a world where disputes were settled primarily by force to one where negotiation and a signed piece of parchment could carry genuine weight. A king's promise was no longer just his word. It was now a matter of record, a commitment that could be pointed to, referenced, and theoretically at least held up as a standard for behavior. This established a crucial precedent for accountability between powers. Consider the Kadesh peace treaty, negotiated between the Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses II and the Hittite king Hattusili III around 1258 B. C. Inscribed on silver tablets, this agreement to end a long and costly war is often considered the oldest surviving peace treaty in the world. It didn't just declare an end to hostilities, it included detailed clauses on mutual assistance, the extradition of political refugees, and respect for each other's territorial boundaries. This was diplomacy in its infancy, yet it already displayed a sophisticated understanding of the elements needed for a lasting peace. Beyond the battlefield, trade was a powerful motivator for these early accords. Flourishing commerce routes between distant lands required a basic framework of trust and predictable rules. Treaties would guarantee safe passage for merchants, establish agreed-upon tariffs, and set out terms for resolving commercial disputes. These economic agreements effectively drew invisible yet powerful borders around zones of influence and economic interest, creating early spheres of control that would later harden into political frontiers. The impact of these initial steps cannot be overstated. They planted the seed for the entire modern system of international relations. They established core principles that we still rely on: the sanctity of agreements, the concept of negotiating parties being bound by their signatures, and the very notion that a border could be a mutually recognized line rather than just the farthest point an army could march. Every United Nations convention, every World Trade Organization rule, and every modern bilateral agreement sits upon the foundation laid by these first tentative attempts to bring order to a chaotic world. They provided the essential grammar for the language of diplomacy we still speak today. But if those early treaties were the first hesitant steps, then the Peace of Westphalia was the moment diplomacy learned to run. Signed in 1648, this wasn't just another peace agreement to end yet another European war. This was a monumental overhaul of the entire political operating system, a complete rewrite of the rules that would echo for centuries. The 30 Years' War it concluded was a catastrophic conflict, a brutal and complex mix of religious fervor and political ambition that had ravaged Central Europe, leaving entire regions depopulated and decimated. The sheer scale of the destruction made it clear to the exhausted powers that a radical new approach was needed, something far more robust and systematic than the ad hoc agreements of the past. What emerged from the negotiations in the German region of Westphalia was nothing less than the birth certificate of the modern nation-state. Its most revolutionary and enduring contribution was the establishment of the principle of territorial sovereignty. This concept seems obvious to us now, but in 1648 it was a paradigm shift. It declared that each state, each recognized political entity, held exclusive and ultimate authority within its own borders. The internal affairs of a kingdom, its laws, its religion, its governance, were its own business, not a matter for outside interference or imposition. A prince or a parliament could rule their territory without needing to answer to a distant emperor or a foreign pope. This was the legal foundation for the world of separate, independent countries we live in today. This new sovereignty demanded a new kind of border. Gone were the vague, overlapping, and constantly contested frontier zones of the feudal era. Westphalia championed the idea of clearly defined, mutually recognized lines on a map. A border was no longer just a place where your army's influence faded. It was a legal barrier, an inviolable line that marked the absolute limit of your jurisdiction and the beginning of your neighbors. This required a new culture of diplomacy based on mutual recognition. You had to acknowledge your neighbor's right to exist within their lines just as they acknowledged yours. It transformed the map of Europe from a blurry painting into a precise, if still jigsaw-like mosaic of distinct colors. The architects of Westphalia were practical people solving a practical problem: how to stop a continent from tearing itself apart. They likely had no idea they were creating a blueprint that would be exported across the globe. But the Westphalian model of the sovereign state with fixed borders became the gold standard, the only acceptable form of political organization in the international community. When new nations emerged from crumbling empires or threw off the yoke of colonization centuries later, They didn't invent a new template. They fashioned themselves in the Westphalian image, claiming a defined territory and sovereign control over it. This 370-year-old peace treaty, born from the ashes of a religious war, is the reason we organize our world into the colorful, separate blocks we see on every classroom map today. If the Peace of Westphalia was about European powers meticulously drawing lines around their own homes, the colonial era was about them recklessly sketching on a stranger's map. As European ships began crisscrossing the globe, a new and profoundly consequential chapter in treaty-making began, one driven not by mutual exhaustion after war, but by unbridled ambition and a staggering sense of entitlement. The age of exploration quickly became the age of exploitation, and treaties were the primary legal instrument used to legitimize the grab for foreign land. This was diplomacy weaponized, a process where agreements were less about negotiation and more about imposition, creating borders that were arbitrary, illogical, and utterly devastating for the people who already called those lands home. Perhaps no single document captures this audacious spirit better than the Treaty of Tordesillas, signed in 1494. Picture the scene: Pope Alexander VI, acting as a kind of divine cartographer for the Catholic monarchs of Europe, draws a line down a map of the Atlantic Ocean. Everything to the east of this line, he decrees, belongs to Portugal. Everything to the west belongs to Spain. With a few strokes of a pen, two European powers had divided the entire unknown world between themselves, a world they had not yet even fully discovered, and one that was already teeming with millions of people from sophisticated civilizations. The arrogance is breathtaking. It was as if the intricate societies of the Aztec and Inca empires, the countless tribes of North and South America, simply did not exist in the European political imagination. Their homelands were not nations to be respected, but empty space to be allocated. This approach became the standard playbook for centuries of colonial expansion. European diplomats and officials, sitting in comfortable London clubs or ornate Parisian palaces, would lean over large, often inaccurate maps of Africa, Asia, and the Americas. They would draw straight lines, follow latitudes, or use distant rivers as convenient markers, carving up continents into neat, color-coded colonies for the sake of administrative ease and to prevent conflicts amongst themselves. The Berlin Conference of 1884 stands as the starkest example of this. Chancellor Otto von Bismarck of Germany hosted a meeting of European powers to establish the rules for the colonization of Africa. Not a single African leader was invited to the table. The continent was treated like a giant cake to be sliced and served according to European appetites, with borders that cut directly through ancient kingdoms, ethnic homelands, and sacred tribal land. The consequences of this cartographic arrogance are the borders we see on maps of Africa and the Middle East today. Those strikingly straight lines that look so unnatural, so deliberately drawn with a ruler. These borders paid no heed to the human geography on the ground. They forced rival ethnic groups into the same artificial state while splitting unified cultures across multiple, often hostile colonies. A family belonging to the same tribe could suddenly find themselves subjects of the French Empire in one village and the British Empire in the next, governed by different laws, educated in different languages, and set on divergent historical paths. These were not borders that grew organically from shared history or geography. They were scars inflicted from the outside, wounds that never fully healed. This legacy is the source of so much modern political instability. When these colonies eventually gained independence in the 20th century, they were almost universally advised to keep these colonial borders under the principle of uti possidetis, meaning as you possess. The international community, fearing endless border wars, argued for stability over justice. So, the new nations of Africa and Asia were born shackled to the arbitrary lines drawn by their former oppressors. Today, conflicts over resources, internal rebellions by marginalized ethnic groups, and cross-border tensions can often be traced directly back to those treaties signed in faraway capitals by men who never set foot on the soil they so casually divided. The map of our world is still haunted by the ghosts of these colonial agreements, a permanent reminder of a time when whole continents were treated as a blank slate for the ambitions of others. After the revolutionary chaos and continent-shattering ambitions of Napoleon, Europe was left exhausted, its old order shattered and its map a confusing mess of dissolved states and shifted allegiances. The victorious powers knew that simply winning the war was not enough. They needed to win the peace, to construct a new system that would prevent another such cataclysm from ever emerging again. So, in 1815, they gathered in Vienna for what remains one of the most ambitious and consequential diplomatic summits in history. This was not a quick signing ceremony. The Congress of Vienna was a lavish, months-long event, a whirlwind of balls, dinners, and secret backroom deals where the fate of millions was decided between glasses of champagne and whispered conversations. The goal was starkly conservative: to turn back the clock, to restore stability and order by putting the genie of revolution back in its bottle. Led by shrewd statesmen like Austria's Prince Metternich, the architects of the Congress operated on a few key principles. The most famous was the principle of legitimacy, which aimed to restore the old monarchies that Napoleon had toppled, placing kings like Louis XVIII of France back on their thrones. This was about more than just rewarding loyal allies. It was a philosophical statement that rightful, hereditary rule was the only stable foundation for society. Alongside this ran the concept of the balance of power. The diplomats were terrified of any single nation becoming so powerful that it could dominate the continent as France just had. So they meticulously redrew the map not based on the wishes of local populations, but as a complex geopolitical puzzle. Borders were shifted to simultaneously strengthen the nations surrounding France and ensure that no other power, like Russia or a newly enlarged Prussia, could become the next Napoleon. The territorial changes were sweeping and dramatic. To create a strong buffer zone against future French expansion, the Austrian Netherlands were merged with the Dutch Republic to form a new Kingdom of the Netherlands. Various German states were loosely consolidated into a German confederation, with Austria holding a dominant position, a move intended to provide collective security, but which also planted the seeds for future German unification. Prussia was significantly enlarged with new territories in the Rhineland, strategically placing it as a sentinel on the Rhine River. Even Norway was transferred from Danish to Swedish rule as a reward for Sweden's support. Every change on the map was a calculated move in a grand strategy to create equilibrium, a self-regulating system where the major powers would keep each other in check. For decades, the Vienna system was remarkably successful in its primary aim. It prevented a major general European war for nearly a century. It created an era of relative peace where commerce and culture could flourish. However, in its obsessive focus on stability and the rights of kings, the Congress completely ignored the powerful new force that Napoleon's conquests had unleashed: nationalism. By drawing borders for strategic convenience and handing entire populations from one monarch to another without their consent, the diplomats in Vienna created powder kegs of resentment. Italians were left divided under multiple foreign rulers. Poles saw their hopes for a restored state crushed as their lands were partitioned once again. German nationalists chafed under Austrian dominance. The Congress had built a dam against the old threat of imperial ambition, but it could not hold back the rising tide of popular will and the desire for self-determination. The very borders they drew to ensure peace would become the flashpoints for the revolutions and wars of the 19th and 20th centuries, proving that a treaty designed to end all wars could only ever be a temporary fix, not a permanent solution. While European diplomats were busy redrawing the political map in places like Vienna, they often looked to the physical map for guidance, turning to the earth itself to provide clear, undeniable lines of separation. Rivers, mountain ranges, and coastlines became the preferred tools of the treaty maker, offering a seemingly perfect solution to the messy problem of defining where one nation's power ended and another's began. These natural boundaries were gifts from geography, providing a visible, permanent, and mutually understandable reference point that everyone could agree on. A river's flow or a mountain's ridge was a fact on the ground, a feature that could be pointed to by a farmer in a field or a soldier on patrol, making the abstract concept of a border suddenly tangible and real. The advantages of using nature's blueprint were immediately obvious. First and foremost, these features were easily identifiable. In an age before satellite imagery and precise GPS coordinates, trying to mark a border along an imaginary line of latitude through a dense forest or a featureless plain was a recipe for confusion and conflict. A great river like the Rhine in Europe or the Rio Grande in North America created a clear, unambiguous line of separation. It was a border you could see and hear. Mountain ranges like the Pyrenees between France and Spain or the Alps separating Italy from its neighbors presented a formidable natural barrier. They were difficult to cross, which provided a built-in measure of security. An army would think twice before attempting to march an entire force over a high mountain pass, making these borders naturally defensible and therefore desirable for nations seeking to protect their territory. The Treaty of the Pyrenees in 1659 is a classic example of this logic in action. After decades of war and squabbling over the region between them, France and Spain finally sat down and agreed to use the imposing wall of the Pyrenees Mountains as their permanent divider. It was a decision born of exhaustion and practicality. The mountains were already a cultural and linguistic frontier, and making them a political one too seemed like the most sensible and lasting solution. That treaty, signed over 350 years ago, still defines the core of the Franco-Spanish border today, a testament to the enduring power of a well-chosen natural boundary. This same principle was applied across the globe. The St. Lawrence River and the Great Lakes became the watery spine of the border between the United States and Canada, a sprawling natural division that has fostered one of the most peaceful relationships between two nations in history. But for all their apparent perfection, natural boundaries came with their own unique set of problems that would haunt diplomats for centuries. Rivers, the most commonly used features, are notoriously fickle. They flood, they erode their banks, they silt up, and most problematically, they sometimes change course entirely. A treaty might declare that the thalweg, or the deepest navigable channel of a river, is the official border. But what happens when a gradual process of erosion causes the river to bend slightly, shifting that channel and suddenly placing a valuable piece of farmland or even an entire village on the other side of the line? This is not a theoretical problem. The shifting path of the Rio Grande has repeatedly caused the border between the United States and Mexico to move, leading to tense negotiations and land swaps to correct what the river itself has undone. Mountains, while more stable than rivers, presented a different kind of challenge, the problem of inaccurate mapping. The early cartographers who sketched the maps attached to treaties were working with rudimentary tools and often limited first-hand knowledge of the treacherous terrain. A treaty might declare that the border runs along the highest crest of a mountain range, but actually surveying that jagged, snow-covered crestline on the ground was a dangerous and nearly impossible task. Disputes would inevitably arise when better maps were made generations later, revealing that the line everyone had assumed was correct was actually miles off. The border between Chile and Argentina in the remote southern Andes was long disputed because 19th-century treaties relied on vague descriptions and inaccurate maps of the watershed divide. It took until the late 20th century, with modern surveying technology, to finally settle arguments over glaciers and peaks that had been poorly described on paper 100 years earlier. So, while turning to nature for answers seemed like the ultimate act of diplomatic simplicity, it often sowed the seeds for future complexity. A border based on a mountain or a river was a living border, subject to the slow, inexorable forces of geology and hydrology. This meant that a treaty signed in the 17th century couldn't just be filed away and forgotten. It became a living document requiring constant interpretation and occasional renegotiation as the very ground beneath it shifted. The Earth's permanence was an illusion, and the diplomats who trusted it too completely often passed on a legacy of geographical ambiguity to future generations. While rivers and mountains provided a seemingly objective geographical logic for drawing borders, another far more human factor has always complicated the map: the invisible lines of language and culture. Long before the modern concept of the nation-state, people defined themselves by shared tongues, traditions, and faiths, creating organic communities that paid little heed to the political frontiers imposed by kings and emperors. As the diplomatic world evolved, treaty makers increasingly grappled with this reality. The ideal emerged of creating borders that aligned with these cultural frontiers, a notion that the people within a state should share a common identity, that a nation and its territory should be one and the same. This philosophy reached its zenith after the First World War, an attempt to fix the mistakes of the past with a powerful new principle, but it would prove to be one of history's most noble yet disastrous experiments in social engineering. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, was the great arena where this idea was put to the test. The war had shattered the vast, multi-ethnic empires of the Ottomans, Austro-Hungarians, and Russians, leaving a power vacuum and a tangled knot of nationalities in Central and Eastern Europe. Into this chaos stepped the American President Woodrow Wilson, armed with his 14 points and the potent ideal of self-determination. He championed the right of people to choose their own political destiny, to form their own states based on their national character. The peace conference became a frantic effort to redraw the map according to this new moral compass, to create a Europe where Poles, Czechs, Slovaks, and others could finally have homelands of their own. It was a radical departure from the cynical land grabs of the Congress of Vienna, an attempt to build a just and lasting peace on the foundation of human identity rather than royal inheritance or strategic advantage. The result was a map that looked wonderfully tidy in the conference halls of Paris, but was heartbreakingly messy on the ground. Teams of geographers, historians, and ethnographers pored over maps and population data, trying to draw lines that neatly contained each linguistic group. New nations like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia were literally called into existence on the basis of cultural kinship. But the reality was that centuries of migration and intermingling had created a deeply heterogeneous population. There were no pure zones where only one group lived. Instead, the region was a vibrant, complicated mosaic. For every majority Polish city, there was a nearby village with a strong German minority. The Sudetenland region of New Czechoslovakia was predominantly German-speaking. Hundreds of thousands of Hungarians suddenly found themselves living as minorities in Romania, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia, cut off from their motherland by the new borders. The treaty makers faced an impossible choice: create perfectly ethnically pure states with wildly impractical, zigzagging borders, or draw sensible economic and strategic lines that inevitably left large minority groups stranded. They almost always chose the latter. This well-intentioned but imperfect application of self-determination planted the seeds for the next World War and decades of subsequent conflict. The presence of aggrieved German minorities in Poland and Czechoslovakia became a central rallying cry for Adolf Hitler, providing the pretext for his expansionist demands that led directly to the invasion of Poland. The artificial state of Yugoslavia, which bundled together rival Slavic groups Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, Bosniaks under one forced identity, held together for decades under strongman rule only to explode with horrific violence in the 1990s when that rule collapsed. The borders drawn to solve the problem of empire had instead created new problems of irredentism and ethnic tension, proving that it is nearly impossible to fit the beautiful, abstract idea of a nation into the messy, concrete reality of a border. The legacy of this interplay between culture and cartography is still with us today. It explains why the border between Italy and Austria still allows for significant autonomy for the German-speaking South Tyrol region, a careful management of a cultural minority that has ensured peace. It's why the division of Ireland and Northern Ireland remains a sensitive issue, a border that divided an island not just politically but along deep religious and cultural lines. And it's why you can find Hungarian-speaking villages in Romania or Polish-speaking communities in Lithuania, living testaments to the imperfect lines drawn a century ago. These borders do more than just mark territory. They shape identity, often forcing people to choose between the language they speak at home and the passport they carry. The great challenge that Versailles revealed, and that we still face, is that human culture is a fluid, living thing, while borders are, by their very nature, fixed and rigid. Trying to make the map reflect the soul of a people is perhaps the most difficult task a diplomat can ever undertake. A reminder that the most enduring borders are not just those made of ink and paper, but those woven into the complex tapestry of human belonging. If the Congress of Vienna represented European diplomats drawing lines around their own neighborhood with a calculated, if flawed, sense of order, then what unfolded in Africa later that century was a chaotic and ruthless land grab of staggering proportions. The so-called Scramble for Africa was a feverish race, a geopolitical gold rush where European powers used treaties not as instruments of careful negotiation, but as blunt tools of division and conquest. This was not diplomacy, it was a mad dash to paint the map in colonial colors, and the continent of Africa was the canvas. In just a few decades, from the 1880s to the eve of World War I, almost an entire continent, home to thousands of distinct cultures and ancient kingdoms, was carved up and claimed by foreign powers. And the primary mechanism for this takeover was a piece of paper, the treaty. The entire process was formalized and legitimized at the infamous Berlin Conference of 1884. Convened by German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, this meeting had a chillingly bureaucratic purpose: to establish the ground rules for the partition of Africa and to prevent the European powers from going to war with each other over the spoils. Think about that for a moment. The continent that was being divided was not represented at the table. Not a single African leader was invited. In smoke-filled rooms in Germany, men who had never set foot in Africa, who knew little of its geography and even less of its people, drew lines on maps with rulers and pencils. They divided the continent according to their own rivalries and appetites, using latitudes and longitudes, following the courses of rivers they could not name, and creating borders that were geometric, arbitrary, and utterly senseless to the realities on the ground. For the European powers, the treaty was the essential legal weapon. Officials, missionaries, and adventurers were sent into the interior with stacks of pre-written documents, seeking the signatures of local chiefs and kings. These encounters were profoundly unequal. Often, the treaties were written only in English or French, languages the African leaders could not read. The concepts within them, like the permanent cession of sovereignty, were foreign to political systems based on communal land stewardship and flexible allegiances. Many leaders believed they were signing agreements for trade, military protection, or friendship, not the permanent surrender of their land and people. They were sometimes coerced with promises of support against rival groups, or bribed with trivial goods like bolts of cloth, bottles of gin, or modern rifles. In one notorious example, a treaty was signed with an X by a local leader who was actually a minor chief with no authority to cede land, yet that mark was accepted as legally binding by the European power eager for a claim. The consequence of this treaty-making frenzy was a map that looks like a bizarre patchwork quilt of straight lines and right angles, a cartographic crime against human geography. The borders drawn in Berlin sliced through the heart of ethnic homelands, dividing unified cultures between two, sometimes three, different colonial regimes. The Hausa people found themselves split between French Niger and British Nigeria. The Maasai were divided between British Kenya and German Tanganyika. The Bakongo Kingdom was fragmented into French Congo, Belgian Congo, and Portuguese Angola. This was not an unfortunate side effect, it was a deliberate strategy. Dividing powerful ethnic groups made them easier to control and prevented large-scale, unified rebellions against colonial rule. It forced people who spoke the same language and shared the same history to become subjects of different empires, educated in different languages, and taught to see their brothers and sisters across the border as foreigners. When the wave of decolonization finally swept across Africa in the mid-20th century, the new independent nations were immediately confronted with this toxic inheritance. The international community, fearing endless border wars, pressured them to adopt the principle of uti possidetis, meaning, as you possess, and maintain the colonial borders to ensure stability. So, the new countries of Nigeria, Kenya, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo were born within the exact same artificial, nonsensical boundaries drawn in Europe decades earlier. They were handed the keys to states that had never existed before, nations with no historical unity, containing a volatile mix of rival ethnic groups that had been forced together and others that had been torn apart. The modern struggles of many African nations' internal civil wars, secessionist movements, disputes over resource-rich border regions, and persistent political instability are not a reflection of some inherent African turmoil. They are the direct, living legacy of those treaties signed under duress over a century ago. The scramble for Africa did not end when the last European flag was raised. It simply entered a new phase, and its divisive scars are etched permanently into the landscape and the lives of millions. If the Congress of Vienna was an attempt to restore an old world order, then the Treaty of Versailles was a desperate and ultimately catastrophic attempt to invent a new one from the ashes of the most devastating war humanity had yet seen. Signed in the Hall of Mirrors in 1919, this was not merely a peace treaty. It was a seismic event that shattered old empires and violently gave birth to new nations, all while planting the poisonous seeds for an even greater conflict. The scale of the destruction from the Great War was unimaginable: millions dead, economies shattered, entire generations lost. The victors, particularly France, Britain, and the United States, arrived in Paris not just to make peace, but to ensure such a war could never happen again. Their solution was a document of breathtaking ambition and profound folly, one that would redraw the map of Europe with a mixture of idealistic hope and punitive vengeance. The most visible and immediate impact of Versailles was the literal dismantling of the ancient continental empires that had dominated for centuries. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, a sprawling multi-ethnic state at the heart of Europe, was broken apart into a collection of new, smaller nations. Austria and Hungary were reduced to small rump states, while their former territories were used to create Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia, and given to a newly independent Poland and an enlarged Romania. To the east, the vast Ottoman Empire was dismembered, its Middle Eastern territories carved up into British and French mandates, artificial constructs that would later become the modern states of Iraq, Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon, drawn with the same arbitrary straight lines that had plagued Africa. The German Empire, too, was stripped of its overseas colonies and of significant European territory. This was a radical reorganization of the continent, an attempt to replace the old, unstable imperial model with a new system based on the principle of national self-determination. This principle, championed fervently by American President Woodrow Wilson, was the great moral engine of the treaty. The idea was simple and powerful. People who shared a common language, culture, and history and nationality should have the right to govern themselves within their own state. On paper, this was a noble and just aim, a direct repudiation of the old diplomacy of kings and empires. It led to the glorious resurrection of Poland after more than a century of partition, giving the Polish people a homeland on the map once more. It created Czechoslovakia, a new democracy intended to unite the closely related Czechs and Slovaks. The borders of Romania were greatly expanded to include millions of ethnic Romanians previously living under Hungarian rule. The map was being redrawn not for strategic advantage, but for the sake of human identity. But the application of this beautiful idea on the ground was impossibly messy. Central and Eastern Europe was not a neat set of distinct ethnic blocs. It was a complex, interwoven tapestry of Germans, Poles, Hungarians, Slovaks, Romanians, Ukrainians, and many others, living side by side for generations. It was simply impossible to draw any coherent border that would not leave significant minority populations on the wrong side. The new Polish state, for instance, contained large minorities of Germans and Ukrainians. Millions of ethnic Germans suddenly found themselves as citizens of Poland, Czechoslovakia, and other new countries. The region of the Sudetenland, given to Czechoslovakia, was overwhelmingly populated by Germans. These new borders, intended to solve ethnic problems, simply created new ones, manufacturing instant ethnic tensions and providing a ready-made grievance for any future demagogue to exploit. And then there was the treatment of Germany itself. Beyond the loss of its empire and European territory, the treaty inflicted two deeply resented punishments. First was the infamous War Guilt Clause, Article 231, which forced Germany to accept sole responsibility for causing the war. This was a national humiliation that struck at the very heart of German pride. Second were the crushing reparations payments, a staggering sum of gold marks that the German economy, already broken by the war, had no hope of paying. The French, in particular, insisted on these terms to cripple their historic rival and secure their border. The result was economic catastrophe in Germany, hyperinflation that wiped out the savings of the middle class, mass unemployment, and a deep, seething sense of national victimhood. This toxic atmosphere of resentment and humiliation became the fertile ground in which extremist ideologies could grow. A young, bitter war veteran named Adolf Hitler would rise to power by relentlessly attacking the dictated Peace of Versailles, promising to tear up the treaty, restore German pride, and reclaim lost territory. The treaty designed to end all wars had, in effect, created the perfect conditions for the next one. The Treaty of Versailles stands as history's ultimate lesson in the law of unintended consequences. Its architects, from the idealistic Wilson to the vengeful French Premier Georges Clemenceau, genuinely believed they were crafting a lasting peace. They applied the latest principles of political science and geography to the map. But in their focus on grand ideas and punitive measures, they failed to account for human psychology, economic reality, and the sheer, tangled complexity of European history. They created new borders that were just as unstable as the old ones, and they burdened a nation with a sense of injustice that would eventually explode. The treaty did not just redraw the map, it altered the very psychological and political trajectory of the 20th century, proving that even the most well-intentioned lines on a map can, when drawn without wisdom and foresight, become the fault lines for future disasters. The devastation of the Second World War left the world with a stark and painful realization. The old ways of conducting international affairs had catastrophically failed. The League of Nations, the previous attempt at global collective security, had proven powerless to stop the march of fascism and the horrors that followed. From the rubble of this global conflict arose a new determination to build a better, more stable system, one with real teeth and universal membership. This ambition gave birth to the United Nations in 1945, an organization designed not just to stop wars, but to create a comprehensive framework for peaceful coexistence. For the first time in history, a permanent, global institution was established with the explicit mandate to develop and codify the rules of international life, breathing new life and structure into the ancient practice of treaty-making and giving it a modern, legalistic backbone. At the very heart of this new system was the United Nations Charter, a foundational treaty that itself became the supreme law of the international community. The Charter did something remarkable. It simultaneously looked backward and forward. It firmly reaffirmed the centuries-old Westphalian principle of the sovereign equality of all states, declaring that every member nation, regardless of its size or power, had an inviolable right to its territorial integrity and political independence. This was a direct repudiation of the kind of aggressive expansionism that had just plunged the world into war. Yet, it also looked forward by creating a powerful Security Council tasked with enforcing this peace, a significant step beyond the old, purely voluntary system of diplomacy. The UN became the ultimate guardian of the treaty-based world order, providing a neutral forum where agreements could be negotiated, a legal framework to give them force, and a mechanism, however imperfect, to hold violators accountable. This new environment supercharged the evolution of international law. The UN didn't just host diplomacy, it actively manufactured it through a continuous process of codification and development. Specialized agencies like the International Law Commission were established to draft model treaties and conventions on everything from the law of the sea to diplomatic relations. Think of it as creating a standardized global operating system for state interaction. For border disputes, this was a revolution. The UN provided a suite of sophisticated new tools beyond the threat of war. Nations could now bring their disagreements to the International Court of Justice for a legally binding judgment. They could engage in mediation led by the Secretary General. Or they could work through countless specialized committees and commissions designed to facilitate peaceful settlement. This institutionalization of conflict resolution meant that a border disagreement no longer had to be an immediate prelude to mobilization. There was now a recognized, orderly process to follow, a diplomatic circuit breaker that had not existed before. Perhaps the most profound and paradoxical impact of the UN on the world's borders came through its central role in the great wave of decolonization. As former colonies across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East began demanding independence, the international community faced a terrifying question. How could this process happen without plunging the entire world into a chaotic free-for-all of territorial claims and endless war? The answer, championed strongly within the UN, was a legal principle called uti possidetis juris. This Latin phrase, meaning "as you possess," essentially dictated that the new independent states should inherit the exact administrative borders they had as colonies. On the surface, this seemed like a shocking decision. After all, these were the very same arbitrary, often nonsensical lines drawn by European powers during the Scramble for Africa and other colonial ventures, borders that had been imposed without consent and that divided cultures and ecosystems. Why would the UN, an organization founded on justice and self-determination, choose to freeze these unjust boundaries in place? The reasoning was brutally pragmatic and centered on one overwhelming priority: stability. The founding fathers of these new nations, leaders like Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana and Julius Nyerere of Tanzania, along with UN diplomats, faced an impossible choice. They could try to redraw the map along ethnic, linguistic, or historical lines, a noble idea in theory, but a guaranteed path to endless conflict in practice. Who would decide which of the hundreds of ethnic groups deserved a state? How would they untangle centuries of intermingled populations? The potential for catastrophic violence and balkanization was immense. The other option was to accept the colonial borders as a necessary evil, a pre-existing administrative reality that, for all its flaws, provided a clear and unambiguous starting point. Uti possidetis was chosen as the least bad option. It was a desperate pact for peace, an agreement among new states that they would not challenge each other's inherited borders, lest the entire post-colonial project collapse into a vortex of irredentist claims and territorial wars before it even began. The UN provided the legal and political cover for this difficult choice, effectively globalizing the principle and making it a cornerstone of modern international law. This decision, more than any other, explains why the map of Africa looks the way it does today, a permanent monument to a pragmatic, if deeply flawed, compromise between the ideal of justice and the desperate need for order. So we arrive at one of the most fascinating and contradictory principles in all of international law, a legal doctrine born from pragmatism that has frozen some of the world's most arbitrary lines in place. This is the principle of uti possidetis, a Latin phrase meaning "as you possess." In essence, it dictates that when a colony gains its independence, it should inherit the exact same administrative borders it had under its former colonial ruler. It's the international equivalent of moving out of your parents' house and taking your childhood bedroom's dimensions with you to define your first apartment. The shape is familiar, but it might not fit your new life at all. This idea emerged not once, but twice in modern history, first in the 19th century as Spanish rule crumbled in the Americas, and then again with tremendous force in the 20th century during the great wave of African and Asian decolonization. Its initial application was a masterstroke of practical necessity. After the wars of independence across Latin America, the new revolutionary leaders, figures like Simón Bolívar, faced a terrifying prospect. The Spanish Empire had been a single, vast administrative unit. If they tried to redraw the map from scratch based on historical claims or ethnic boundaries, the continent could easily have descended into an endless series of bloody wars between the new republics, each claiming slices of the former empire. So they made a pragmatic pact. They agreed to accept the old Spanish colonial administrative boundaries as the new international borders. They chose the devil they knew over the chaos they didn't. This decision provided a clear, unambiguous starting point and is a major reason why, despite some conflicts, Latin America has largely avoided the kind of border redrawing wars that have plagued other continents. The lines on the map, originally drawn for Madrid's convenience, became permanent. A century later, the leaders of newly independent African nations found themselves in an almost identical predicament, but with even higher stakes. The Organization of African Unity, the precursor to the African Union, looked at the Latin American example and saw a solution to a potentially existential problem. The map they inherited from the Berlin Conference was a cartographic nightmare, a jigsaw puzzle of straight lines that sliced through ethnic groups and ancient kingdoms. The immediate temptation for any new leader might have been to try and fix these obvious injustices, to reclaim lost ancestral lands or unite divided peoples. But the founding fathers of modern Africa, visionaries like Tanzania's Julius Nyerere and Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah, understood that this path led directly to disaster. If Somalia could claim parts of Ethiopia for ethnic Somalis, then Kenya could claim parts of Uganda, and Nigeria could fracture into a dozen ethnic mini-states. The entire continent risked collapsing into an infinite regress of territorial claims and counterclaims, a perpetual war of all against all. So, in a breathtaking act of collective pragmatism, they embraced ut possidetis as a solemn principle. It was a grand bargain, a non-aggression pact written in the language of international law. By agreeing to respect the colonial borders, every new state guaranteed every other new state's existence. It was a sacrifice of historical and ethnic justice on the altar of stability and survival. This decision is the single biggest reason why Africa, for all its post-independence challenges, has experienced remarkably few interstate wars over borders. The borders themselves became sacrosanct, the inviolable foundation upon which the fragile project of Pan-African unity could be built. Yet, for all the stability it provided, ut possidetis has a profound and deeply troubling legacy. By freezing these colonial borders in place, the international community effectively gave a permanent stamp of approval to some of history's greatest geographical crimes. It legitimized the lines drawn by European diplomats who had never visited the lands they were dividing, lines that paid no heed to the human reality on the ground. This is why we see the Bakongo people split between Angola, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and the Republic of the Congo. It's why the Somalis are divided among Somalia, Ethiopia, and Kenya. These artificial borders have been a primary source of internal conflict, fueling civil wars, secessionist movements, and endless disputes over resources. Governments often struggle to create a sense of national identity in a state whose boundaries feel arbitrary to its own citizens, where your closest kin might live just on the other side of a line that was never meant to be there. The doctrine's complexity was starkly revealed in the 1990s during the breakup of Yugoslavia. Here, the international community applied ut possidetis in reverse. They argued that the internal administrative borders between the Yugoslav republic's lines drawn by Tito's communist government should become the new international frontiers of the independent states like Bosnia, Croatia, and Serbia. This decision, intended to prevent a land grab by Serbia, instantly turned ethnic minorities within each new country into major political problems, contributing directly to the horrific ethnic cleansing that followed. It showed that ut possidetis is not a magic bullet for peace. It is a tool, and its moral value depends entirely on the context of its application. It can preserve stability, but it can also cement deep injustices, creating a world where the hurried, often ignorant decisions of colonial cartographers continue to dictate the destinies of millions, long after the empires themselves have faded into history. To truly grasp the enduring and often painful legacy of colonial map-making, we need to look no further than the fraught and rugged frontier between Afghanistan and Pakistan. This is the story of the Durand Line, a border that feels less like a line on a map and more like an open wound, a perfect case study in how a treaty signed in a different century, under vastly different circumstances, can continue to shape and shatter lives today. The year was 1893. Sir Henry Mortimer Durand, the Foreign Secretary of British India, was dispatched to Kabul to negotiate a boundary with the Amir of Afghanistan, Abdur Rahman Khan. The British Empire's goal was strategic: to create a clear, fixed frontier that would secure the northwestern flank of their prized Indian colony, acting as a buffer against Russian influence. For the Afghan Amir, the situation was one of immense pressure. He was essentially strong-armed into an agreement with a far more powerful empire, trading a slice of his sovereignty for the promise of protection and a subsidy. The line they drew was over 1,500 miles long, stretching from the snow-capped peaks of the Hindu Kush down to the deserts of Balochistan. But this was no natural division following mountain ridges or great rivers. It was a largely arbitrary line, sliced directly through the heart of the Pashtun homeland, a vast region known as Pashtunistan that had existed for centuries. The Pashtun people, bound by a strict tribal code of honor known as Pashtunwali, with deep ties of blood, culture, and language, suddenly found themselves bisected. A family, a clan, even a single village could now be split in two, with one half falling under British Indian administration and the other remaining in Afghanistan. For a people who had never recognized such external impositions, the Durand Line was not just a border, it was an insult, a foreign invention that violated their very understanding of community and land. When the British Empire retreated from the subcontinent in 1947, the newly created state of Pakistan inherited the Durand Line as its western international border. Afghanistan, however, immediately and vehemently objected. From Kabul's perspective, the agreement had been a coerced deal between the British and a single Afghan ruler. It was not a permanent treaty binding on future generations, and certainly not on the new state of Pakistan. Afghanistan refused to recognize the line and became the only country to vote against Pakistan's admission to the United Nations. This fundamental disagreement over the border's legitimacy has been the central, toxic fact of Afghan-Pakistani relations ever since. For decades, Afghanistan openly supported the idea of an independent Pashtunistan, further inflaming tensions with its neighbor. The human consequence of this colonial cartography is a state of perpetual tension and confusion. The border region has never been fully controlled by either central government. On the Pakistani side, the area is administered as the federally administered tribal areas, a zone that for most of its history was governed by a special set of colonial era laws, making it a de facto semi-autonomous region. The Pashtun tribes on both sides of the line maintain their cross-border connections, often paying little heed to the official boundary, which they continue to view as illegitimate. This fluidity has made the region a haven for instability. During the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, it became a base for Mujahideen fighters. Later, the Pakistani side became a sanctuary for the Taliban, and the area remains a hotbed for militant activity to this day. The Durand Line is therefore so much more than a historical footnote. It is a live wire, an active and potent symbol of how a treaty imposed by an external power for its own strategic convenience can outlive that empire by centuries, continuing to generate conflict and hinder development. It demonstrates the brutal clash between the modern world's demand for fixed, sovereign borders and the ancient, enduring realities of ethnic and tribal identity. Every drone strike, every military incursion, every diplomatic spat between Kabul and Islamabad is in some way a ripple effect from that meeting in 1893. It is a powerful reminder that borders are not just political abstractions. They are drawn through the lives of real people, and when those lines are drawn without regard for those people, the legacy is one of endless friction and sorrow. But a treaty is more than just words on a page. It is a promise tied to a place, a description of a line that must exist not only in law but on the land itself. This is where the art and science of cartography becomes indispensable, the crucial link between diplomatic agreement and tangible reality. From the very beginning, maps have been the silent partners to every treaty, the visual aids that attempt to translate abstract legal clauses into a concrete picture of the world. They are the proof, the guide, and all too often the source of a whole new set of problems. The history of border treaties is, in many ways, a parallel history of our ever-evolving struggle to map the world with perfect accuracy. In the early days of diplomacy, the maps attached to treaties were less scientific instruments and more like persuasive artworks. Imagine a royal cartographer hunched over a parchment by candlelight, using quill and ink to sketch the rough outlines of a coastline or the general sweep of a mountain range. These were often beautiful, hand-drawn creations, but they were plagued by a lack of precise measurement. Distances were estimated, features were exaggerated for emphasis, and vast swaths of territory were simply labeled as unknown or filled with decorative monsters. When the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783 to end the American Revolutionary War, it described the new border of the United States using terms like the northwesternmost point of the Lake of the Woods and a line running west from the Lake of the Woods to the Mississippi River. There was just one problem. The mapmakers of the time believed the Mississippi River extended much farther north than it actually does, meaning this described line was geographically impossible. This cartographic error sowed decades of confusion and required further treaties to untangle, a clear example of how a beautiful map could create an ugly dispute. These rudimentary tools meant that border demarcation was a process fraught with ambiguity. A treaty might declare that the border follows a particular river, but which branch of that river at its delta? Does it follow the main channel or the deepest navigable channel for ships? If it follows a mountain crest, does that mean the highest peaks or the watershed divide where the rain flows in opposite directions? Without precise geographical data, these questions were left to the interpretation of the officials on the ground, often leading to competing claims and, at times, armed standoffs. The process of actually marking the border, placing physical monuments, clearing sightlines, and creating a joint commission map was where the true meaning of the treaty was tested and defined, often years after the diplomats had signed their names and gone home. The great leap forward came with the technological revolution in cartography, the invention of precise surveying equipment like the theodolite, the development of trigonometric surveys, and later, the advent of aerial photography began to remove the guesswork from mapmaking. Borders could now be defined not by vague descriptions of natural features, but by precise astronomical coordinates of latitude and longitude. This shift reached its apex in the 20th and 21st centuries with satellite imagery and global positioning systems. Modern border treaties, like those governing maritime boundaries in the South China Sea or the detailed demarcation between Saudi Arabia and Yemen, are masterpieces of technical precision. They define borders down to the last meter using a series of interconnected GPS points, creating a virtual fence in the digital ether that can be monitored in real time. This technological arms race in mapping has been a powerful force for clarity, reducing the ambiguous no-man's lands that were once breeding grounds for conflict. And yet, for all our modern precision, the old, flawed maps never truly lose their power. In fact, in the world of international law, a historical map can be worth more than all the satellite data in the world. This is because these antique documents are considered part of the original treaty itself, the best evidence of what the signatories intended at the time they made their agreement. This principle is at the heart of one of the world's most tense and ongoing border disputes, the conflict between India and China along their Himalayan frontier. The core of the argument hinges on a single, seemingly simple line drawn on a map over a century ago. The McMahon Line was proposed by British diplomat Henry McMahon in 1914 as part of a treaty between Britain and Tibet. China, which has never recognized Tibetan independence, vehemently rejects the validity of this line and the map that contains it. Instead, it advances its own claim based on a different, fuzzier historical cartographic tradition. Both sides have spent decades in a kind of archival arms race, scouring libraries and vaults for ancient maps that support their respective interpretations. They are not just looking for geographical accuracy, they are hunting for a piece of paper that carries the legal weight of a promise, proving that their version of the border is the one that was originally intended. This clash demonstrates that a border is not just a line in the present, but an argument about the past fought with the weapons of cartography. The evolution from hand-sketched parchment to satellite-coordinated waypoints is a story of our striving for perfect control over the messy reality of geography. We have moved from describing borders through prose and approximation to defining them with mathematical certainty. This has undoubtedly prevented countless disputes, turning what were once fertile grounds for conflict into lines so clear they are virtually uncontested. But as the India-China example shows, technology cannot simply erase history. The old maps retain their legal and symbolic power, their faded lines continuing to shape the destinies of nations. The journey of cartography in treaty enforcement is a reminder that while we can now map the world with incredible accuracy, the most difficult borders to define are not those made of rock and river, but those drawn in the ink of history and memory. While diplomats spoke of honor and sovereignty, the relentless engine of commerce was often the true architect behind the lines on the map. Behind the grand ideals of peace and stability, there frequently lay a much more pragmatic and powerful motivator: economic gain. The control of lucrative trade routes, the access to precious resources, and the domination of new markets were not just side effects of border treaties, they were often their primary purpose. A river was not just a natural barrier, it was a commercial highway. A mountain pass was not merely a defensive position, it was a choke point on a Silk Road. The history of border making is, in many ways, a hidden history of economic ambition, where the flow of gold and goods quietly dictated the placement of frontiers. Consider the Treaty of Nanking, signed in 1842 to conclude the First Opium War. On the surface, it was a military settlement, a document that forced a humiliated King China to cede the island of Hong Kong to the British Empire. But to view it only through a military lens is to miss its true revolutionary impact. The treaty's most consequential clauses were economic. It forcibly opened 5 key Chinese ports: Canton, Amoy, Fuzhou, Ningpo, and Shanghai to British merchants, creating designated zones where foreign traders could operate under their own laws. This wasn't just about opening doors, it was about redrawing the very economic map of East Asia. It established a system of extraterritoriality that carved out economic enclaves within Chinese sovereignty, effectively creating borders within borders. The treaty didn't just move a political line. It created an entirely new economic reality, one that prioritized foreign access to China's vast markets and resources, setting a pattern of economic imperialism that would dominate the region for a century. This pattern of resource-driven cartography repeats itself across the globe. In Europe, the Rhine River is more than a natural border between nations like France and Germany. For centuries, it has been one of the continent's most vital economic arteries. Control over its banks meant control over the flow of goods from the interior to the North Sea ports. Treaties that adjusted the border along the Rhine were often less about national glory and more about which power would profit from the tolls and trade on that bustling waterway. Similarly, the Amazon basin in South America, a seemingly impenetrable wilderness, became a subject of intense treaty-making between Spain and Portugal, and later between the independent nations that emerged. The borders drawn through these vast rainforests were not just about claiming territory, they were about laying exclusive claim to the unimaginable wealth believed to be hidden within: rubber, gold, and timber. The borders were, in effect, giant property lines drawn around future commodities. This economic logic extends to the very minerals under the ground. The partition of Upper Silesia after World War I, dictated by the Treaty of Versailles, was a nightmare of economic and ethnic considerations. This industrially rich region was a tangled web of Polish and German communities sitting atop a vast coalfield. The treaty couldn't simply draw a clean ethnic line because doing so would have placed critical industrial infrastructure and mines on the wrong side of the border, crippling one economy to benefit another. The solution was a complex plebiscite and a subsequent division that tried, and largely failed, to balance the right of self-determination with the cold, hard need for economic viability. The border here was drawn not with a sword but with a calculator, its zigzagging path a testament to the immense power of economic necessity over clean cartography. The legacy of these economically motivated decisions is the world we live in today. Modern borders continue to dictate patterns of wealth and poverty. A country blessed with a coastline has immediate access to maritime trade routes, while a landlocked nation is forever dependent on the goodwill of its neighbors for economic survival, a reality painfully clear for nations like Bolivia or Nepal. The arbitrary colonial borders in Africa often placed entire mineral deposits, diamonds in Sierra Leone, oil in Nigeria within one state, creating both a potential source of immense wealth and a powerful magnet for corruption, conflict, and what economists call the resource curse. The border itself becomes a value proposition, determining which nation gets to sell the oil, mine the copper, or dam the river for hydroelectric power. This enduring economic dimension helps explain why some border disputes are so intractable and why some treaties, no matter how old, remain fiercely relevant. A disagreement over a few miles of barren, rocky coastline might seem trivial until you realize that stretch of water contains valuable fishing stocks, potential oil reserves, or control of a key shipping lane. The conflict in the South China Sea is the ultimate modern example, where obscure historical treaties and maps are being weaponized in a high-stakes struggle for control of some of the world's busiest trade routes and suspected energy deposits. The border here is not just a line of sovereignty, it is a line that divides who gets to be rich and who gets left behind. Understanding this forces us to see borders not as abstract political concepts, but as the frozen embodiment of ancient economic battles, the permanent record of who got the treasure and who was left with the map. While diplomats and merchants often looked at borders as lines of commerce or cultural division, there was another, far more primal force shaping the map, the unblinking eye of the military strategist. For much of human history, the primary purpose of a border was not to facilitate trade or define identity, but to ensure survival. A frontier was a potential front line, and every treaty negotiation was shadowed by the grim calculation of how to gain a tactical edge over a potential adversary. This martial logic transformed geography into a weapon, turning rivers into moats, mountain ranges into ramparts, and entire landscapes into instruments of national defense, creating borders that were designed not for people but for armies. This defensive mindset explains the overwhelming preference for natural boundaries in so many historical treaties. A great river was not merely a convenient marker, it was a formidable obstacle. An invading force would have to pause, gather boats or build bridges, all while exposed to defenders on the opposite bank. The Rhine River, for centuries a contested frontier between France and the German states, served exactly this purpose. It was a liquid fortification, a strategic asset so valuable that control of its banks became a central goal of European warfare and diplomacy for generations. Similarly, mountain ranges like the Pyrenees or the Alps presented a logistical nightmare for any army. The narrow passes could be easily defended by a small force against a much larger one, making these high-altitude borders incredibly cost-effective for the nations behind them. The Treaty of the Pyrenees in 1659, which firmly established the mountain chain as the border between France and Spain, was as much a military decision as a political one. It gave both kingdoms a massive, permanent defensive advantage, allowing them to reduce their standing armies along that frontier and focus their resources elsewhere. But the military influence on borders went far beyond passive defense. Treaties were frequently used as surgical instruments to deliberately weaken a rival and create a more favorable balance of power. The treatment of France after the Napoleonic Wars is a textbook example. The Treaty of Paris in 1814 and the subsequent Congress of Vienna were not about finding a fair or natural boundary. They were about constructing a geopolitical cage. The victorious allies, particularly Prussia and Britain, insisted on pushing France's borders back to their pre-revolutionary lines, but they went much further. To the north and east, they deliberately strengthened France's neighbors. They gave the Rhineland to Prussia, not out of generosity, but to transform Prussia into a permanent sentinel on the Rhine, a strong German state that would always stand as a bulwark against future French expansionism. They created a new kingdom of the Netherlands as another powerful buffer state. Every adjustment to the map was a calculated move to contain French power, to surround it with stronger states, and to make it geographically harder for France to ever threaten the continent again. The border was engineered as a tool of constraint. This strategic cartography also created vulnerabilities that would haunt the future. Perhaps the most infamous example is the peculiar status of the Alsace-Lorraine region, nestled between France and Germany. This resource-rich area became a geopolitical ping-pong ball, changing hands multiple times after major conflicts precisely because it lacked a strong natural defensive boundary. Whichever nation controlled it possessed a staging ground for invasion into the other. Its possession by Germany after the Franco-Prussian War of 1871 was a constant, open wound for France and a primary motivator for its desire for revenge in World War I. Conversely, the demilitarization of the Rhineland after World War I, another treaty-imposed military border condition, was among the first provisions Hitler brazenly violated, a clear early sign of his aggressive intent that the other powers fatally ignored. These zones were not just territory, They were tripwires and barometers of European tension, directly created by treaty mandates. The legacy of this military logic is deeply embedded in our modern world and continues to dictate defense policy. The 49 parallel dividing North Korea and South Korea is not just a political border, it is the most heavily fortified strip of land on Earth, bristling with landmines, artillery, and tens of thousands of troops staring each other down every day. Its location was chosen at the end of the Korean War for straightforward military reasons. It represented roughly the stalemate line between the two armies. In the Middle East, the Golan Heights, captured by Israel from Syria in 1967, is a classic case of a strategic high ground. Control of this plateau provides a crucial defensive buffer against attack and a commanding view of northern Israel, making it a piece of territory whose military value outweighs almost all other considerations in any peace negotiation. These examples reveal a fundamental truth often obscured by the clean lines on a map. Borders conceived in war rooms and treaty halls are instruments of power. They are the physical embodiment of a nation's fears and its ambitions, its assessment of threats and its plans for security. They can be shields like the English Channel for Britain. They can be sheaths like the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean for the United States, or they can be swords like a strategically salient jutting into an adversary's territory. The next time you look at a map, try to see it not just as a political document, but as a military one. Look for the rivers that form moats, the mountains that form walls, and the plains that form invasion routes. You will begin to see the ghost of every general and diplomat who ever leaned over a map, not thinking about people or culture, but calculating how to best use the lay of the land to keep their nation safe from the army on the other side. For all the talk of strategy and economics, one of the most potent and deeply personal forces shaping the world's borders has been faith. Throughout history, religious difference has been a powerful catalyst for conflict, and in its aftermath, a primary consideration for diplomats seeking a lasting peace. This led to a unique form of cartography, where borders were drawn not just around land but around souls, creating frontiers intended to separate warring creeds and protect vulnerable religious communities. These faith-based boundaries reveal a profound truth, that the most enduring borders are often those that divide not just territory, but deeply held beliefs about God, community, and the very meaning of life itself. One of the earliest and most influential attempts to use political geography to solve a religious problem emerged from the bloody religious wars that tore apart the heart of Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries. The Peace of Augsburg in 1555 was a desperate effort to stop the violent conflict between Catholics and Protestants within the Holy Roman Empire. Its solution was a revolutionary legal principle, cuius regio, ius religio, a Latin phrase meaning whose realm their religion. This doctrine granted each individual prince or local ruler the right to decide the official faith of his own territory. If your ruler was Lutheran, your territory became Lutheran. If he converted to Catholicism, your entire domain switched with him. Subjects who dissented were given the right to emigrate to a region that aligned with their faith. While the treaty didn't explicitly redraw the map with new international borders, its effect on the political landscape was profound and indirect. It effectively baked religious affiliation into the identity of each tiny German state within the empire. Over time, these internal religious boundaries began to harden, influencing alliances, cultural exchanges, and even dynastic marriages. A Catholic prince was more likely to align with other Catholic territories, creating a loose patchwork of faith-based spheres of influence. The principle established at Augsburg that political authority could dictate religious geography became a template for managing religious conflict through division, an idea that would echo for centuries. It was a pragmatic, if brutally simple, solution. If people of different faiths couldn't live together in peace, then the map would be rearranged to help them live apart. This strategy of separation reached its most devastating and consequential application in the 20th century with the partition of British India in 1947. As the British Empire prepared to withdraw, the subcontinent was engulfed by rising tensions between its Hindu and Muslim populations. The Muslim League, led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, argued that Muslims would never be safe in a Hindu-majority India and demanded a separate homeland, Pakistan. The result was a border drawn almost entirely along religious lines, a rushed and chaotic process led by a British lawyer, Sir Cyril Radcliffe, who had never before visited India. Working with outdated maps and imperfect census data, Radcliffe had just 5 weeks to draw a line that would divide the provinces of Punjab and Bengal, regions where Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs had lived intermixed for centuries. The moment the new border was announced, it triggered one of the largest and most violent mass migrations in human history. Approximately 15 million people, Hindus and Sikhs fleeing what was now Pakistan, and Muslims fleeing what was now India, grabbed what they could carry and fled across the new frontier. The human cost was unimaginable. Massacres, riots, and atrocities erupted along the route as ancient communal hatreds, now sharpened by the sudden, brutal reality of the border, exploded into horrific violence. It is estimated that over 1 million people lost their lives in the ensuing chaos. The new border, intended to solve a religious problem by creating 2 separate nations, instead unleashed a firestorm of suffering that neither country has ever fully forgotten. The legacy of this faith-based partition is a permanent state of tension between India and Pakistan. The border itself, particularly in the disputed region of Kashmir, remains one of the most militarized places on Earth. The initial violence of 1947 established a pattern of distrust and hostility that has led to 3 major wars and countless smaller clashes. The border is not just a line on a map, it is a wound that has never healed, a permanent symbol of a traumatic divorce. It stands as a stark lesson in the limits of cartography. You can draw a line to separate religions on a map, but you cannot so easily untangle the complex human relationships, the shared history, and the deep-seated animosities that exist on the ground. The partition proved that a border based solely on religious identity can be a source of perpetual conflict rather than a guarantee of peace. This powerful and often tragic religious dimension continues to shape border politics in critical regions like the Middle East. The modern borders of the region, largely drawn by European powers after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, often paid little heed to the delicate sectarian balances between Sunnis, Shias, Christians, and other groups. The creation of Iraq, for instance, bundled together a Shia majority in the south, a Sunni minority in the center, and a Kurdish population in the north, a volatile mix that has fueled internal strife for decades. Similarly, the ongoing conflict in Syria has clear sectarian undercurrents. Even the establishment of Israel in 1948, a state created as a national homeland for the Jewish people, is fundamentally a border story driven by religious and historical claims to the same land that is also deeply sacred to Muslims and Christians. In this region, faith, land, and political sovereignty are inextricably linked, making every border dispute not just a political argument, but a deeply theological one as well. The enduring influence of religion on borders shows that in the human heart, a line separating 2 faiths can be as real and as formidable as any mountain range or river. While European powers were busy drawing lines across continents to suit their own strategic and economic games, a different, more intimate form of treaty-making was unfolding on the ground between colonizing governments and the indigenous peoples who had called these lands home for millennia. These agreements were not between equal sovereign states in the Westphalian sense. They were almost always negotiations between vastly unequal powers, where immense pressure, cultural misunderstanding, and sometimes outright deception were used to acquire vast swaths of territory. Indigenous leaders, whether Maori chiefs in New Zealand or Native American tribal nations across North America, often entered into these treaties believing they were forging partnerships, securing protection, or agreeing to share the land, not to surrender it entirely. The documents they signed, or more often marked with totemic symbols and signatures, were based on a profound clash of worldviews. For European settlers, land was a commodity to be owned, bounded, and sold. For indigenous cultures, the relationship with the land was one of stewardship, spirituality, and deep, inseparable connection, a concept that was often impossible to translate into the rigid legal language of a property deed. This fundamental disconnect lies at the heart of a legal and moral struggle that is far from over. The Treaty of Waitangi, signed in 1840 between representatives of the British Crown and hundreds of Maori chiefs, is a powerful and ongoing example of this clash and its modern repercussions. The treaty actually exists in two versions, one in English and one in Maori, and they are not identical. The English version claimed the Maori ceded sovereignty to the British Crown, while the Maori version used the word Kawanatanga, a transliteration of governance, suggesting a much more limited transfer of power. Crucially, the Maori version guaranteed them Tino Rangatiratanga, absolute chieftainship or full authority over their lands, forests, fisheries, and other treasures. For over a century, the New Zealand government largely ignored the Maori interpretation, operating on the English text and systematically dispossessing Maori of their lands. But in 1975, the New Zealand government established the Waitangi Tribunal, a permanent commission of inquiry tasked with investigating Crown actions that breached the promises of the treaty. This was a monumental shift. The tribunal hears claims, researches historical grievances, and makes recommendations to the government for settlements, which can include financial compensation, the return of culturally significant land, and formal apologies. This process has forced a modern nation to continually renegotiate its very foundation, not by discarding the treaty, but by finally striving to understand it in the spirit its indigenous signatories intended. A similar story, though even more complex and fractured, unfolded across the United States and Canada. From the late 18th to the late 19th centuries, the federal governments entered into hundreds of distinct treaties with Native American tribes. These agreements were as diverse as the tribes themselves. Some were peace treaties after conflicts, others were land cessions, and many promised essential services like healthcare, education, and protection in perpetuity in exchange for vast territories. The language within them is a haunting ledger of broken promises. Reservations were established, often on a fraction of the tribe's original homeland, and even these guaranteed territories were frequently reduced or seized later when valuable resources like gold or oil were discovered. For generations, these treaties were treated as relics of a conquered past, their terms ignored or unenforced. But much like in New Zealand, the late 20th century saw a powerful resurgence of indigenous rights movements that took these old documents off the shelf and into the courtrooms. They argued that these treaties were not historical curiosities, but were, and still are, legally binding nation-to-nation agreements. This modern legal awakening has transformed the landscape of indigenous law. In the United States, landmark court cases have reaffirmed treaty-guaranteed rights to hunt, fish, and gather on ancestral lands, even if those lands are now privately owned. In Canada, comprehensive land claim agreements have led to the creation of new self-governing territories like Nunavut, giving the Inuit people control over their own political and cultural destiny. These are not simply symbolic victories, they have tangible, powerful effects. A treaty right to fish can dictate modern conservation policy and commercial fishing quotas. A successful land claim can halt a pipeline project or a logging operation, forcing national and multinational corporations to negotiate directly with indigenous governments. The map is being subtly but significantly redrawn, not by moving international boundaries, but by reasserting layers of jurisdiction and sovereignty that had been suppressed for over a century. These are borders within borders, legal landscapes that recognize the enduring authority of the First Peoples. This global reevaluation is about more than just land or money. It is a profound process of historical accountability and the slow, painful work of reconciliation. It forces settler societies to confront the uncomfortable truths of their founding, to acknowledge that their nations were built upon a foundation of broken promises and deliberate dispossession. For indigenous communities, the fight to have these treaties honored is a fight for cultural survival, for the right to steward the lands that hold their ancestors and their identities, and for economic self-determination. It demonstrates, perhaps more powerfully than any other example, that a treaty is never truly finished. Its meaning evolves with each generation, and its power lies not in the ink that dried centuries ago, but in the ongoing courage of people who refuse to let their history be erased. These ancient agreements, born from imbalance, are now being wielded as living instruments of justice, proving that the most enduring borders are those that are not just drawn on the land, but etched into the conscience of a nation. But what happens when the promises made on those ancient parchments are called into question, when two nations stare across a contested frontier, each holding up a different piece of faded paper as proof of their rightful claim? This is the moment when the world turns to a uniquely modern invention to solve an ancient problem: the International Court of Law. Institutions like the International Court of Justice in The Hague have become the supreme arbiters of history, the places where the cryptic language of centuries-old treaties is put under a legal microscope to settle the disputes of the present. These courtrooms are where the ghosts of long-dead diplomats are called to the witness stand, their words dissected by teams of lawyers and judges to determine the course of today's borders, proving that these documents are not relics but living, breathing instruments of international order. The process is painstaking, a form of high-stakes historical detective work. Take the long-running maritime dispute between Nicaragua and Colombia in the Caribbean Sea. At the heart of the argument were treaties and agreements dating back to the early 19th century, when the Spanish Empire was crumbling and new nations were emerging. The legal teams for each country presented a mountain of evidence, not just the treaties themselves, but also the maps that accompanied them, the diplomatic correspondence between officials, and the records of how the border had been practically understood and enforced for the past 200 years. The judges of the International Court of Justice had to immerse themselves in the geopolitical context of 1822 or 1928 to understand what a phrase like "the maritime frontier shall be the meridian of the Cape" truly meant to the people who wrote it. They weren't just reading words, they were interpreting the intent of diplomats from a bygone era, translating the cartographic understanding of the past into the precise legal language of modern international law, which relies on geographic coordinates and equidistant lines. This isn't a dry academic exercise, It is the essential work of preventing a diplomatic disagreement from escalating into a military confrontation. The authority of these courts to make these final calls is what transforms historical treaties from interesting artifacts into active, powerful legal tools. When the International Court of Justice issues a ruling, as it did in the Nicaragua-Colombia case, it is binding under international law. This means a treaty signed by a Spanish king and a Colombian official in the 1800s can directly determine the rights of a Nicaraguan fisherman in the 21st century, dictating which nation has the right to the resources in a specific patch of ocean. This judicial enforcement mechanism is the glue that holds the entire treaty-based system together. It provides a peaceful, orderly alternative to the law of the jungle, offering a path to resolution that doesn't require warships or soldiers. A nation's strength is measured not by the size of its army, but by the strength of its archival research and the persuasiveness of its legal arguments. This process of judicial interpretation also ensures these old documents can adapt to a changing world. The law of the sea, for instance, has evolved dramatically since many of these treaties were written. The concept of an exclusive economic zone, giving a state special rights regarding the exploration and use of marine resources up to 200 nautical miles from its coast, is a modern invention established by the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea in the 1980s. International courts are often tasked with the delicate job of applying old bilateral treaties to this new universal legal framework. They have to decide, for example, if a historic agreement dividing islands between two nations also implicitly divided the vast maritime resources and seabed that those islands now generate under modern law. In doing so, the courts are not erasing history. They are bridging it, finding ways to make the intentions of the past compatible with the realities and needs of the present, ensuring these centuries-old handshakes continue to have meaning in a world their signatories could never have imagined. This judicial layer adds a profound finality and clarity to the story of borders. It demonstrates that the power of a treaty does not fade with the ink on its pages. Instead, its meaning is continuously refined and enforced by the most respected legal bodies in the world. Every time a court rules based on a historical document, it reaffirms a fundamental principle of global stability, that a nation's word, once given, is its bond, and that this bond is strong enough to transcend centuries and hold the line against chaos. The courtrooms of The Hague and other international tribunals are the guardians of this promise, the quiet, methodical engines that ensure the lines drawn long ago continue to define our world with justice and order. For centuries, diplomats have relied on the seeming permanence of the natural world to anchor their agreements, using rivers, coastlines, and mountain ridges as the ultimate reference points for borders they believed would stand the test of time. But now, the very ground beneath those treaties is shifting, quite literally. Climate change is no longer a future threat. It is a present-day force actively destabilizing the foundational logic of countless international agreements. The planet's physical transformation is introducing a bizarre and unprecedented legal dilemma. What happens to a border when the land market was based on simply disappears or moves? This environmental upheaval is forcing the world of international law to confront a question it was never designed to answer. How do you reconcile a static, ink and paper treaty with a dynamic, changing Earth? The most immediate and visible crisis is unfolding along the world's coastlines. Rising sea levels, driven by melting polar ice and the thermal expansion of seawater, are not just an environmental tragedy, they are a geopolitical event. For low-lying island nations and coastal states, this means their sovereign territory is physically shrinking. Consider the plight of the Maldives, a nation whose highest point is barely above 2 meters. As the ocean claims more land, its maritime borders which extend outward to define its exclusive economic zone and its rights to fishing and undersea resources would, under traditional law, also shrink inward. This could mean the loss of vast, resource-rich ocean territories that are vital to its economy and survival. The very existence of such nations is threatened by a phenomenon they did almost nothing to cause, and the treaties that guarantee their statehood offer no protection against being physically erased from the map. This isn't a hypothetical future, it is a slow-motion national emergency happening right now, and it challenges the core principle that a state's territory is inviolable and permanent. The problem becomes even more complex with borders defined by rivers, which have been a convenient marker for thousands of treaties. A border might be defined as the median line of the Rio Grande or the main channel of the Brahmaputra River. But rivers are not static lines, they are living, shifting systems. Climate change is intensifying this natural volatility through more extreme weather patterns, prolonged droughts that reduce a river to a trickle and alter its channel, and catastrophic floods that can carve an entirely new course overnight. If a river that forms the border between two countries changes its path, does the international border follow it? This is not a trivial question. A shift of even a few hundred meters could place a village, a farm, or a strategic piece of land on the other side of a national frontier, potentially placing citizens under a different government's jurisdiction without them ever moving an inch. The potential for conflict is immense, as neighboring states could be tempted to use these geographical changes to make new territorial claims, or could clash over the costly and technically complex work of river management and border demarcation. Meanwhile, at the top of the world, a different kind of border transformation is taking place. The Arctic ice cap is melting at an alarming rate, opening up sea lanes that were once impassable and revealing untold reserves of oil, gas, and minerals beneath the ocean floor. This sudden accessibility has triggered a 21st century scramble, with Arctic nations Russia, Canada, the United States, Norway, and Denmark rushing to stake their claims based on the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. This modern gold rush has, in turn, breathed strange new life into a century-old treaty, the Svalbard Treaty of 1920. This agreement granted Norway sovereignty over the Svalbard archipelago, but stipulated that all signatory nations would have equal rights to engage in commercial activities there. At the time, this meant coal mining, but today, as the ice retreats, those commercial activities could be interpreted to include fishing in the newly ice-free waters, or even exploiting oil and gas reserves on the continental shelf. Norway argues the treaty's terms apply only to the land territory of the islands, while other signatories are beginning to argue for a broader interpretation. A document signed in the Age of Steam is now at the center of a debate about 21st century resource rights, showing how climate change can resurrect and reinterpret the past in utterly unexpected ways. These environmental shifts force a profound reckoning with the very nature of international agreements. Treaties are designed to be permanent, to create a stable and predictable order. But they are built on an assumption that the physical world is a stable and predictable constant. Climate change has shattered that assumption. We are now entering an era where the maps used by diplomats may have a shorter shelf life than the treaties they are supposed to illustrate. This demands a new kind of diplomacy, one that is flexible, adaptive, and anticipatory. It may require building clauses into new treaties that allow for border adjustments based on agreed-upon scientific measurements of environmental change. It will certainly require unprecedented cooperation on shared resources like rivers, transforming them from potential sources of conflict into arenas of collaborative management. The greatest test posed by climate change may not be to our coastlines or our glaciers, but to our capacity for legal and political innovation, proving that the most enduring agreements will be those that can learn to bend with the changing Earth rather than break against it. While the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity remain firmly rooted in those centuries-old treaties, the tools used to enforce them are undergoing a revolution straight out of science fiction. We've moved far beyond the era of soldiers walking a line or relying on hand-sketched maps. Today, the guardians of our borders are just as likely to be silent, unblinking satellites in orbit or autonomous drones buzzing high over a desert. This digital transformation is creating a new kind of border, one that is less a physical fence and more a constantly shifting, intelligent web of surveillance and data, all dedicated to making the abstract lines on a map into an inescapable digital reality. Consider the vast, remote stretches of borderland in places like the American Southwest or the rugged terrain between Central Asian nations. For generations, these areas were almost impossible to monitor consistently. Today, they are bathed in a blanket of sensory awareness. High-resolution satellites can spot the footprints of a single individual crossing illegally. Long-endurance drones equipped with infrared and night vision capabilities can patrol for days on end, relaying real-time video to a command center thousands of miles away. Networks of seismic sensors buried in the ground can detect foot traffic, while automated license plate readers scan vehicles at official crossings, instantly checking them against international databases. This suite of technology creates a persistent surveillance zone, making it exponentially harder to violate a border undetected and ensuring that the terms of a treaty, which promise a nation control over its territory, can be enforced with unprecedented efficiency. But the digital revolution is doing more than just watching. It's also creating a new, unbreakable language for the treaties themselves. The age-old problem of disputed maps and ambiguous wording is being tackled with blockchain technology. Imagine a future where a new border agreement isn't just signed on paper, but is cryptographically encoded into a distributed digital ledger. Every detail, the precise GPS coordinates, the agreed-upon descriptions, the signed documents, would become part of an immutable, tamper-proof record. No single country could unilaterally alter it. Any attempt to change the record would be instantly visible to all parties, creating a permanent and indisputable source of truth. This could drastically reduce the kind of he said, she said disputes that have led to conflicts throughout history, moving border management from the realm of historical interpretation into one of mathematical certainty. However, this brave new world of digital borders comes with a thicket of profound ethical and legal questions that we are only beginning to untangle. The same drone that efficiently patrols a remote border for unauthorized crossings might also be indiscriminately collecting data on the daily lives of citizens living nearby, raising serious concerns about a permanent surveillance state. The biometric databases used to swiftly process legitimate travelers at airports, scanning irises, fingerprints, and faces, also create vast troves of incredibly personal information. Who owns this data? How is it protected? Could it be used by governments for purposes far beyond border control? The debate raging over the use of advanced surveillance technologies along the US-Mexico border is a microcosm of this global dilemma, pitting the undeniable benefits of security and treaty enforcement against the fundamental right to privacy and freedom from constant government oversight. Furthermore, this technology challenges the very concept of sovereignty it is meant to protect. When a nation's border enforcement relies on satellites owned by a private corporation or surveillance software developed in another country, it introduces new dependencies and vulnerabilities. The digital border is a shared space reliant on global networks and international cooperation, which can sometimes clash with the Westphalian ideal of absolute control within one's own territory. The digital age has not erased the ancient principles laid down by the first treaties. Instead, it has forced them to evolve, creating a complex hybrid where the inviolability of a border is guaranteed by a global network of technology that itself knows no borders. This fusion of the old and the new is creating a world where a border is simultaneously a line on a map, a clause in a centuries-old document, and a constantly evolving stream of ones and zeros in the cloud. Yet for all their physical presence, the most powerful borders are the ones we cannot see, the ones etched not into the land but into the human mind. A line drawn by treaty does more than separate two pieces of territory. It begins the slow, profound work of forging two distinct peoples from what was once one. It acts as a great psychological divide, compelling those on either side to define themselves not by what they share, but by how they differ. This process of identity building, accelerated and enforced by a political boundary, is one of the most enduring and overlooked legacies of any international agreement. The border becomes a mirror, and over generations, the reflections staring back from each side grow less and less familiar. Nowhere is this fracturing of a shared identity more starkly illustrated than on the Korean peninsula. Before the Second World War, Korea was a single, ancient nation with a unified culture, language, and history stretching back millennia. The division along the 38th parallel in 1945 was a purely administrative decision, a temporary expedient by Allied powers to manage the surrender of Japanese forces. There was no historical, cultural, or geographical logic to this line. It was a random slash across the map, yet this arbitrary division, later hardened by the Korean War and the ensuing armistice, did not just create two states. It set in motion a powerful psychological divergence. In the north, a rigid ideology of Juche, or self-reliance, fused with a cult of personality around the Kim dynasty to create a sealed-off national identity defined by opposition to the outside world. In the south, rapid industrialization, democratization, and embrace of global culture forged a completely different sense of self-outward-looking and economically dynamic. Over decades, this political separation has created a tangible cultural rift. The Korean language itself is evolving differently on each side of the demilitarized zone, with Northerners incorporating new political terminology and Southerners adopting English loanwords. Customs, social norms, and even body language have diverged. When families tragically separated by the war are occasionally reunited, they often find they have become strangers to one another, their shared memories overshadowed by a lifetime of living in two utterly different realities. The border did not just keep people from moving, it stopped a shared culture from growing together, forcing it to develop in isolated, opposing directions. The peninsula is a heartbreaking case study in how a treaty-born border can, over time, manufacture two distinct national psyches from a single, homogeneous people. A similar, though more nuanced, story of divided identity unfolds across the island of Ireland. The partition of Ireland in 1921, which created Northern Ireland as part of the United Kingdom, was another treaty-driven act that privileged political settlement over human geography. This border did not simply create a new jurisdiction. It drew a line through a centuries-old conflict between nationalist, predominantly Catholic communities who sought a united Ireland, and unionist, predominantly Protestant communities who fiercely identified as British. The physical border became a constant daily reminder of this deeper identity conflict, reinforcing a sense of us and them. For decades, especially during the period of conflict known as the Troubles, this border was militarized with checkpoints, watchtowers, and British Army patrols. This physical manifestation of division made the identity choice inescapable. The passport you carried, the license plate on your car, the currency you used, even the sport you cheered for, all of these mundane details became loaded markers of which side of the psychological divide you belonged to. The Good Friday Agreement of 1998 brought a fragile peace and made the physical border largely invisible, but the psychological border remains potent. Questions of national identity, of whether one feels Irish, British, or a unique Northern Irish blend, continue to dominate politics and social life. The treaty that drew the line may have been negotiated in London, but its most lasting work has been conducted in the hearts and minds of the people who live with its consequences. This power of borders to shape identity extends far beyond these famous examples, influencing the most intimate aspects of daily life. A border can dictate the language you are educated in, which shapes how you think and what stories you are told about your own history. It determines the media you consume, the news that informs your worldview, and the national heroes you are taught to admire. It influences the food you eat, the holidays you celebrate, and the very rhythm of your life. Over time, these accumulated differences create a powerful sense of shared experience among those within the border, and a sense of otherness for those outside it. This is why a person from Austria and a person from Germany, though they speak the same language, feel a distinct national identity. Their separate political journeys, solidified by different treaties and borders, have nurtured unique cultural and psychological landscapes. The ultimate paradox of the treaty-defined border is that it seeks to impose a clean, legal clarity upon the messy, interconnected reality of human communities. It attempts to create a world of neat, separate boxes, but human identity is fluid and refuses to be so easily contained. The psychological borders that treaties create are often the most difficult to dismantle, outlasting the walls and checkpoints themselves. They remind us that the most significant territory any border encloses is not land, but the human mind itself, and that the signatures of long-dead diplomats can continue to shape how millions of people answer the most fundamental question of all, who we are. Yet, even as technology seems to weave the world closer together, a powerful countercurrent is pulling in the opposite direction, a resurgence of the very Westphalian ideals that first defined the modern border. The last decade has witnessed a dramatic swing back toward nationalism and a reassertion of hardened sovereign boundaries. The Brexit referendum in 2016 stands as a stark symbol of this shift, where the United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union, explicitly rejecting the idea of open internal borders and the supranational authority of Brussels in favor of reclaiming national control over its laws and its frontiers. Across the Atlantic, debates over border security and immigration policy have become central, often toxic, features of political discourse in the United States, leading to calls for and the construction of extensive physical barriers. From Hungary building fences to keep migrants out to India updating its citizenship laws, the nation-state is fiercely reasserting its right to exclude, to control who and what crosses its line. This isn't a rejection of treaties, it's a demand for new ones that prioritize security and sovereignty over connectivity and integration. It proves that the ancient human instinct to belong to a tribe and to protect that tribe's territory is a force that technological change cannot easily erase. So what emerges from this tug of war between a borderless digital future and a walled-off nationalist present? The most likely outcome is not the triumph of one vision over the other, but a complex and often messy hybrid model. We are moving toward a world of differentiated borders, where the experience of crossing depends entirely on who you are. Imagine a future where a physical frontier might be simultaneously hard for some and soft for others. A highly skilled tech worker with a digital passport and a pre-cleared biometric profile might breeze through an automated checkpoint in seconds, barely noticing the border's existence. At that very same crossing, a refugee fleeing conflict or an economic migrant without such digital credentials would face a formidable wall of bureaucracy, surveillance, and physical barriers. The border becomes a filter, not just a fence, sorting people into streams of fast and slow, welcome and unwelcome, based on their perceived economic value or national origin. This new reality will demand a new generation of treaties and international agreements, ones that are far more nuanced and technologically sophisticated than their predecessors. The old documents dealt primarily with where a line was drawn on a map. The new ones will have to grapple with questions of data flow, digital identity, and algorithmic decision-making. We will need agreements on how biometric data collected at one border can be shared with allied nations, and strict international standards to prevent its abuse. We will require treaties that establish the legal rights of individuals subject to automated border control algorithms, ensuring a human can review a decision made by a machine. The ancient principle of diplomatic immunity might need to be updated for a world of cyber attacks and digital espionage, creating new rules for this virtual battlefield. The core principles established by those first treaties, mutual recognition, the sanctity of agreements, and the concept of sovereignty, will not disappear. Instead, they will be stretched and adapted to govern a world where a border is no longer just a line in the dirt, but a layered system of physical barriers, digital checkpoints, and data filters, ensuring that the handshake between nations continues to evolve long into the future. Yet for all the talk of legal principles and strategic advantages, there is a deeper, more uncomfortable question we must ask about these foundational agreements. What is the moral weight of a signature given under duress? How do we judge a handshake between a giant and a child? The entire history of treaty-making is shadowed by profound ethical dilemmas, forcing us to confront the uncomfortable truth that many of the lines on our map were not drawn through mutual agreement, but were instead carved by the sharp tools of coercion, deception, and overwhelming power imbalance. This is the dark underbelly of diplomacy, where the noble concept of a pact becomes a weapon to legitimize theft and domination, leaving a legacy of injustice that the world is still struggling to address. This ethical crisis is most starkly visible in the treaties signed between expanding colonial powers and the indigenous peoples they encountered. These were not negotiations between equals meeting on a level playing field. They were often charades of diplomacy, where the fundamental Western concept of land ownership as a commodity to be permanently sold and transferred was utterly foreign to the indigenous leaders who understood land as a shared resource to be stewarded for future generations. The famous story of the purchase of Manhattan for 60 guilders worth of trade goods is a perfect allegory for this ethical chasm. Even if the transaction did occur as described, the very idea that the island could be sold in perpetuity likely held a completely different meaning for the Lenape people than it did for the Dutch. This was not a meeting of minds, but a conversation between two different worlds, resulting in an agreement that one side fundamentally misunderstood. Across North America, countless treaties were signed with tribes who were facing starvation, the imminent threat of violence, or were deliberately misled about the contents of the documents they were signing with an X. The promises made within them of protected hunting rights, health care, and education in exchange for vast territories were often systematically broken as soon as it became convenient for the expanding settler governments. These agreements were less like treaties and more like forced surrenders dressed in the legalistic clothing of diplomacy, using the language of law to sanitize the reality of dispossession. In response to this long history of broken promises, modern international law has had to develop a more nuanced ethical framework. The ancient Roman legal principle of pacta sunt servanda, agreements must be kept, remains a cornerstone of the global order, providing the essential stability that allows nations to trust each other's word. But this principle is no longer considered absolute. A parallel concept has emerged, the idea that a treaty is void if it was procured by the threat or use of force or through corrupt means. This is the legal world's moral conscience kicking in. It acknowledges that a contract signed at gunpoint is not a true contract at all. This evolving standard is empowering a global movement of reparation and renegotiation. We are witnessing a profound shift from viewing these historical documents as frozen, unchangeable artifacts to treating them as living instruments that must be continuously evaluated against modern standards of justice and fairness. Nowhere is this ethical reckoning more active than in the realm of indigenous land claims and restitution movements. From the icy expanses of Canada to the forests of Scandinavia and the outback of Australia, courts and governments are being forced to reopen the files on centuries-old treaties. The Waitangi Tribunal in New Zealand is a powerful example where the Maori version of the treaty, which guaranteed chieftainship over their resources, is being given equal weight to the English version that ceded sovereignty. This isn't about rewriting history. It's about finally reading it correctly and acknowledging that a foundational agreement was built on a fundamental mistranslation of intent. In Canada, comprehensive land claim settlements have led to the creation of self-governing territories like Nunavut, granting the Inuit people not just compensation, but a meaningful measure of political autonomy and control over their cultural future. These are not acts of charity. They are acts of justice, attempts to honor the spirit of agreements that were dishonored for generations. This movement extends beyond indigenous rights to the broader post-colonial world. The call for reparations for the transatlantic slave trade and for the exploitation of resources during the colonial era is at its heart an ethical argument about the unjust terms of engagement that fueled the rise of the West. It challenges the very foundation of many historical economic relationships, arguing that the prosperity of some nations was built upon a deeply unfair and coercive system that was never truly consensual. This ongoing global dialogue forces us to hold the past accountable. It insists that the map is not a neutral document, but a historical record that can be stained with injustice. The work of today's diplomats, lawyers, and activists is therefore not just about managing the present, but about healing the wounds of the past, ensuring that the borders we inherit are not just lines of control, but can one day become lines of respect and reconciled memory. From the Treaty of Westphalia to the complex digital agreements of today, the story of our world is written in the language of treaties, a continuous narrative of how we choose to define ourselves and our place on the map. These first international agreements were more than just endings to wars or tools of empire. They were the foundational grammar of our global society, establishing the very idea that lines on a map could be made real through mutual recognition and written promise. They gave us the concept of the sovereign state. They attempted to bring order to chaos, and in doing so, they created a legacy that is literally all around us, in every border crossing, every national anthem, and every passport stamp. The decisions made in candlelit chambers by diplomats long turned to dust continue to whisper to us, directing the flow of international trade, shaping the destiny of millions and even fueling the conflicts that dominate our headlines. We live in a world built by handshake agreements that have outlived the empires that made them, a powerful testament to the enduring and often surprising power of the written word. This journey through history reveals a profound and double-edged truth about diplomacy itself. On one hand, it shows us the incredible power of negotiation over force, of the pen truly being mightier than the sword. The Peace of Westphalia ended a continent-shattering war and established a system that, for all its flaws, has prevented a global conflagration for centuries. The Congress of Vienna created a peace that lasted for a generation. The United Nations provided a forum to air grievances without resorting to immediate violence. These are monumental achievements, yet the same diplomatic process has also been used as a weapon of conquest, a tool to legitimize the dispossession of indigenous peoples, the arbitrary carving up of continents, and the imposition of borders that have become permanent sources of tension. A treaty can be an instrument of peace or a document of injustice, sometimes both at once, its moral character depending not on the ink itself, but on the power, dynamics, and intentions of those who wielded the pen. As we stand at the crossroads of the future, facing challenges those early diplomats could never have conceived of, the lessons embedded in these ancient documents have never been more critical. Climate change is melting the very glaciers and raising the very seas that have served as border markers for centuries, forcing us to ask what happens to a nation's sovereignty when its territory physically disappears. The digital revolution is creating new, virtual frontiers that demand new rules of engagement, blurring the lines between domestic and international space. The ongoing calls for justice and the renegotiation of historical treaties remind us that the map is not a fixed, neutral object, but a living record of our collective choices, one that we have both the right and the responsibility to re-examine. The greatest lesson these first treaties teach us is about legacy. They remind us that the agreements we make today about cyberspace, about orbital pathways, about managing a warming planet, are not just for us. We are drawing the lines that our grandchildren will inherit, the foundations upon which their world will be built. Will we choose lines that build walls or bridges? Will our diplomacy be remembered for its fairness or its force? The story of borders is ultimately a story about us, our fears, our ambitions, our capacity for both incredible cooperation and profound conflict. It is a story that is still being written with every negotiation, every international handshake, and every line we draw, both on the land and in our hearts. Thank you for exploring the deep and hidden history of the world's borders with us. We would love to hear which of these treaty stories surprised you the most in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this journey through the mysteries of our map, please subscribe for more adventures